Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God, back with you with the next video in my series reading The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Without further ado, returning to The Invisible Man as read by Lord Naren White. She put on some more coal, unfolded like the clothes horse, and extended the traveller's coat upon this. And they say goggles! Why, he looked more like a divine helmet than a human man. A divin helmet. She hung his muffler on a corner of the horse. And holding that handkerchief over his mouth all the time, talking through it. Perhaps his mouth was hurt too, maybe. She turned around as one who suddenly remembers. Bless my soul alive, she said, going off at a tangent. Ain't you done them taters yet, Millie? When Mrs. Hall went to clear away the stranger's lunch, her idea that his mouth must also have been cut or disfigured in the accident she supposed him to have suffered was confirmed, for he was smoking a pipe, and all the time that she was in the room he never loosened the silk muffler he had wrapped round the lower part of his face to put the mouthpiece to his lips. Yet it was not forgetfulness, for she saw he glanced at it as it smoldered out. He sat in the corner with his back to the window blind and spoke now, having eaten and drunk and being comfortably warmed through, with less aggressive brevity than before. The reflection of the fire lent a kind of red animation to his big spectacles they had lacked hitherto. I have some luggage, he said, at Bramblehurst Station, and he asked her how he could have it sent. He bowed his bandaged head quite politely in acknowledgment of her explanation. Tomorrow, he said. There is no speedier delivery, and seemed quite disappointed when she answered. No. Was she quite sure? No man with a trap would go over. Mrs. Hall, nothing loath, answered his questions and developed a conversation. It's a steep road by the down, sir, she said in answer to the question about a trap, and then, snatching at an opening, said, It was there a carriage was upsettled, a year ago and more. A gentleman killed besides his coachman. Accidents, sir, happen in a moment, don't they? But the visitor was not to be drawn so easily. They do, he said, through his muffler, eyeing her quietly through his impenetrable glasses. But they take long enough to get well, don't they? There was my sister's son. Tom just cut his arm with a scythe, tumbled on it in the field, and, bless me, he was 3 months tied up, sir. You'd hardly believe it. It's regular given me a dread of scythes, sir. I can quite understand that, said the visitor. He was afraid, one time, that he'd have to have an operation. He was that bad, sir. The visitor laughed abruptly, a bark of a laugh that seemed to bite and kill in his mouth. Was he? He said. He was, sir, and no laughing matter to them as had the doing for him, as I had, my sister being took up with her little ones so much. There was bandages to do, sir, and bandages to undo, so that if I may make so bold as to say it, sir. Will you get me some matches? Said the visitor, quite abruptly. My pipe is out. Mrs. Hall was pulled up suddenly. It was certainly rude of him, after telling him all she had done. She gasped at him for a moment and remembered the 2 sovereigns. She went for the matches. Thanks, he said concisely, as she put them down, and turned his shoulder upon her and stared out of the window again. It was altogether too discouraging. Evidently he was sensitive on the operations and bandages. She did not make so bold as to say, however, after all. But his snubbing way had irritated her, and Millie had a hot time of it that afternoon. The visitor remained in the parlor until 4 o'clock, without giving the ghost of an excuse for an intrusion. For the most part he was quite still during that time. It would seem he sat in the growing darkness, smoking in the firelight, perhaps dozing. Once or twice a curious listener might have heard him at the coals, and for the space of 5 minutes he was audible pacing the room. He seemed to be talking to himself, Then the armchair creaked as he sat down again. Chapter 2. Mr. Teddy Henfrey's First Impressions. At 4 o'clock, when it was fairly dark and Mrs. Hall was screwing up her courage to go in and ask her visitor if he would take some tea, Teddy Henfrey, the clock jobber, came into the bar. "My sakes, Mrs. Hall," said he, "but this is terrible weather for thin boots." The snow outside was falling faster. Mrs. Hall agreed, and then noticed he had his bag with him. "Now you're here, Mr. Teddy," said she. "I'd be glad if you'd give the old clock in the parlour a bit of a look. 'Tis going, and it strikes well and hearty, but the hour hand won't do nothing but point at 6. And, leading the way, she went across to the parlour door, and rapped and entered. Her visitor, she saw, as she opened the door, was seated in the armchair before the fire, dozing, it would seem, with his bandaged head drooping on one side. The only light in the room was the red glow from the fire, which lit his eyes like adverse railway signals, but left his downcast face in the darkness. And the scanty vestiges of the day that came in through the open door, everything was ruddy, shadowy, and indistinct to her. The more so since she had just been lighting the bar lamp, and her eyes were dazzled. But for a second it seemed to her that a man she looked at had an enormous mouth wide open, a vast and incredible mouth that swallowed the whole of the lower portion of his face. It was the sensation of a moment, the white bound head, the monstrous goggle eyes, and this huge yawn below it. Then he started up in his chair, and put up his hand. She opened the door wide so that the room was lighter, and she saw him more clearly, with the muffler held up to his face, just as she had seen him hold the serviette before. The shadows, she fancied, had tricked her. "Would you mind, sir? This man a-coming to look at the clock, sir," she said, recovering from the momentary shock. "Look at the clock," he said, staring in a drowsy manner, and speaking over his hand, and then getting more fully awake. "Certainly." Mrs. Hall went away to get a lamp, and he rose and stretched himself. Then came the light, and Mr. Teddy Henfrey, entering, was confronted by this bandaged person. He says, taken aback. "Good afternoon," said the stranger, regarding him, as Mr. Henfrey says, with a vivid sense of the dark spectacles, "like a lobster." "I hope," said Mr. Henfrey, "that it's no intrusion." "None whatever," said the stranger, "though I understand," he said, turning to Mrs. Hall, "that this room is really to be mine for my own private use." "I thought, sir," said Mrs. Hall, "you'd prefer the clock." "Certainly," said the stranger. "Certainly, but as a rule, I like to be alone and undisturbed. But I'm really glad to have the clock seen to," he said, seeing a certain hesitation in Mr. Renfrey's manner. "Very glad." Mr. Renfrey had intended to apologize and withdraw, but this anticipation reassured him. The stranger turned around with his back to the fireplace and put his hand behind his back. "And presently," he said, "when the clock mending is over, I think I should like to have some tea, but not till the clock mending is over." Mrs. Hall was about to leave the room. She made no conversational advances this time, because she did not want to be snubbed in front of Mr. Henfrey. When her visitor asked her if she had made any arrangements about his boxes at Bramblehurst, she told him that she had mentioned the matter to the postman, and that the carrier could bring them over on the morrow. You are certain that is the earliest?" he said. She was certain with a marked coldness. "I should explain," he added, "what I was really too cold and fatigued to do before, that I am an experimental investigator." "Indeed, sir," said Mrs. Hall, much impressed, "and my baggage contains apparatus and appliances." Very useful things indeed they are, sir, said Mrs. Hall, and I'm very naturally anxious to get on with my inquiries. Of course, sir. My reason for coming to Ipping, he proceeded, with a certain deliberation of matter, was a desire for solitude. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. In addition to my work, an accident, I thought as much, said Mrs. Hall to herself, necessitates a certain retirement. My eyes are sometimes so weak and painful, I have to shut myself up in the dark for hours together, lock myself up, sometimes, now and then. Not at present, certainly. At such times, the slightest disturbance, the entry of a stranger into the room, is a source of excruciating annoyance to me. It is well that these things should be understood. Certainly, sir, said Mrs. Hall. And if I might make so bold as to ask, that I think is all, said the stranger, with that quiet, irresistible air of finality he could assume at will. Mrs. Hall reserved her question and sympathy for a better occasion. And we'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and thanks again.